but I'm really excited to get us going because we have a wonderful event for you all today. Uh, so this will be our 11th session of Foreign Affairs and Future Leaders. I can't believe we've been doing this for quite a while now, and we're it's really our pleasure to welcome you to this edition, brought to you by the Onera Institute and the Delta Phi Epsilon Professional Foreign Service Fraternity and Sorority. Today, I am joined by Lucy Hale of the DPE sorority, who will be our moderator, and as well as our lovely speaker, Professor Dinah Shelton. I also want to acknowledge Elizabeth Ball for helping out with the planning of this event. And before we jump right in and I turn over to Lucy, I just want to go over some procedural information. So let's make sure, as always, to show respect for all peers and all topics discussed and challenge ourselves to keep an open mind. Please approach the material professionally and analytically, and be sure to keep your questions pertinent to the discussion at hand. If you'd like to speak, please go ahead and raise your hand using the raise hand feature in participants. And when it comes time to ask questions, you may also use the chat feature. Please also keep your mic muted unless it's your turn to speak. And when you do speak, please share your name and where you're calling from. And I just wanted to let you all know that we'll be recording this session so that we can share it with people who weren't able to attend today. And with that, I'd love to go ahead and turn it over to Lucy and get us started. Lucy.
Thank you a lot. And thank you to Onera for inviting me to moderate. So let's get into it. So today's topic of the event will be, even before the pandemic, Latin America was facing significant human rights challenges. The collapse of Venezuela has resulted in dire humanitarian crisis, with 11 million Venezuelans displaced and over 9 million malnourished, and rampant extrajudicial violence and repression of basic rights by the Maduro regime. In 2019, historic amounts of Latin American women took to the streets to protest gender-based violence, a movement that even gained traction internationally. Finally, climate change remains a prominent concern among human rights groups. The World Bank estimates that climate change could generate 17 million displaced individuals by 2050, disproportionately affecting Latin America's vast indigenous populations. The Organization of American States, founded in 1948, is the preeminent multilateral organization to facilitate regional dialogue in the Western Hemisphere. The Inter-American Commission of Human Rights is an autonomous body of the OAS. The Commission upholds the American Convention on Human Rights and meets regularly to investigate violations of human rights in the Hemisphere. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights was established to interpret the convention. We are so thrilled to be joined today by Professor Dinah Shelton, Manhattan Professor Emeritus at the George Washington University Law School. She was a member of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission from 2010 to 2014 and served as the Commission's president in 2010. Professor Shelton is the author of 3 prize-winning books: Protecting Human Rights in the Americas, co-authored with Thomas Bergenthal, Remedies in International Human Rights Law, and the 3-volume Encyclopedia of Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity. She has also authored articles and books on international law, human rights law, and international environmental law. Professor Shelton is a member of the Board of Editors of the American Journal of International Law. She has served as a legal consultant to international organizations and is on the board of numerous human rights and environmental organizations. In 2006, Professor Shelton was awarded the Elizabeth Hobb Prize for Environmental Law, and in 2013, she received the Goller-Butcher Prize in Human Rights. She was conferred the degree of Doctor Honoris Causa at the University of Stockholm in 2012 and the Pázmány Péter Catholic University of Budapest in 2014. So without further ado, I'd love to turn the mic over to Professor Shelton to give her opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. And thank you a lot for your role in helping to organize this. I'd like to welcome, I'm talking about the regional level or the global level or even within states is a work in progress. It's constantly evolving. And in that regard, the Organization of American States goes all the way back to the period of independence for Latin America, when Simón Bolívar proposed a treaty of confederation of newly independent states in Latin America. The treaty was never ratified, but before long, by the end of the 19th century, the Pan American Union had become the secretariat for periodic meetings of foreign ministers or heads of state of the hemisphere. And human rights issues were taken up very early by this organization, well before not only the UN, but the League of Nations was founded. And in 1907, the Pan American Union created the first international human rights court, the Central American Court of Justice, which existed until 1921 when it stopped functioning. But it had jurisdiction for individuals to sue a state for denial of justice and other abuses. So it was a landmark effort to get human rights abuses before an independent tribunal. The member states also adopted several declarations, including the first Human Rights Declaration in 1942. And then in 1945, the meeting in Bogota adopted the Universal Declaration, the Inter-American Declaration of Human Rights. Some 7 months before the UN adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, making it the first instrument that was applicable throughout the entire region. The next major change that took place was in 1948, when the states transformed the Pan American Union into a regional organization, the Organization of American States, which is the framework in which the Human Rights Program exists today. There are other bodies that deal with human rights, such as the Inter-American Commission on the Status of Women and things like that. And the legal office also deals with human rights issues. But with the adoption of the charter, the organization in Article 3J, which is now Article 3L, proclaimed the fundamental rights of the individual in all states within the hemisphere. So that was the beginning of the human rights movement. There were two problems, though. The declaration was non-binding at that time, and there was no institutional machinery to deal with human rights. That situation existed for about a decade. And then in I'm losing track of the dates, 1959. Not surprising, that date, because it was shortly after the Cuban Revolution took place and a couple of years before the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which the OAS played a prominent role in supporting President Kennedy's call for the Russians to withdraw their missiles from Cuba. In 1959, the organization decided to create an independent human rights body, the Commission on Human Rights, of 7 independent experts elected by the OAS General Assembly to promote and protect human rights within the hemisphere. Now, the date is important not simply because it was focused partly on Cuba, but also partly because many states in the region were not yet independent. The main Caribbean countries, there were only 3 Caribbean countries that were original members of the OAS: Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. None of the rest of them were independent as yet. And I'll come back to why that's significant in a few minutes. So the commission was first elected in 1960. And its primary function at that time was the promotion of human rights. But within a few years, by 1965, the commission's status was ramped up with amendments to its statute, allowing it to hear complaints from individuals and groups about violations of their human rights. So that was a major development. The next big change was that same conference that amended the statute also called for the adoption of a treaty on human rights to cure some of the problems that were stemming from the fact that the declaration was non-binding. So they set about drafting the American Convention on Human Rights, which was finally adopted in 1969. By this point, there were a few more independent Caribbean states, but many of them did not become independent until the late 70s, or in some cases, even the 1980s. And Canada was still focused mainly on the Commonwealth and didn't join the OAS until 1989. So what that meant was that the commission for the first 2 decades was largely a Latin American, Spanish-speaking, male-dominated organization. And so there weren't any women on the commission until decades later. I was the 3rd woman ever elected in 2009 to serve on the commission, the first woman that the US had ever proposed after 50 years of the commission's functioning. So the commission, let me talk a little bit about that. The commission, as I said, is 7 independent experts. And by and large, they are both expert and independent. I never received any instructions from the US government on any issue. Sometimes they would ask me to debrief them on some decisions that the commission had made, but there were a couple of rules that were really important. One is that no member of the commission could ever sit on a case involving their own country, nor could they investigate any issues involving their own country. So that helped to keep some degree of independence in the commission's work. So when I came on in 2009, the commission, as I said, was largely male. There were 2 women on the commission, myself and a woman from Venezuela. Ironically, we actually bonded over women's rights issues, even though politically we were very far apart on other issues. As I said, it was mainly Spanish speaking and male dominated at that point. 2 years later, we had, for the first time in history, a majority of women. 4 out of the 7 members of the commission were women. Hillary Clinton invited us to the State Department to celebrate that victory, and it made a huge difference. In addition, 2 of the 4 women were Caribbean, 3 of the 4 women were English speaking. And that made a huge difference in the approach to human rights issues, because in addition to being English speaking, the 3 of us that were either from the Caribbean or, in my case, the United States, were all trained in common law jurisprudence and legal doctrines. And so many of the terms that we had trouble dealing with in Spanish, we can now use the English and make ourselves better understood. So the commission itself had several functions. I've already mentioned hearing complaints about human rights violations from individuals or groups who allege that their rights have been violated. But that's only one of the functions. The commission also does thematic reports or country reports whenever they feel there's an issue that deserves more widespread attention. So I was involved in several of those reports. Most of them are based on on-site visits to the country in question. So I did on-site visits to Dominican Republic, where the entire commission went, which is a rare thing to happen. I did an on-site mission to Canada to look into the situation of murdered and disappeared indigenous women. I did an on-site to Suriname, where I went to the interior of the jungle to look at the issue of indigenous people. So I got around quite a bit doing this. I went to Jamaica to present the report on Jamaica. Hear the government's response to it, which was very favorable. They had actually made quite a few changes in the couple of years since the report had come out. So we do on-site visits, we do country reports, we do thematic reports, we hold hearings in person during 2 of our 3 sessions. The 3rd session is left to administrative issues. Most of the time, the sessions are held in Washington, D.C., but increasingly in recent years, at least 1 session a year is held at the invitation of a member state in a foreign country. So the commission has gone to Mexico, to Colombia, to Costa Rica for a joint session with the court. And then the commission also drafts an annual report, which has become quite important and controversial because chapter 4 of the report is our naming and shaming device. That's where we put the worst violators of human rights. And countries will do everything they can to avoid being named in chapter 4, to the point where it became quite controversial. And we ended up amending our rules of procedure to make clear what the sources of our information are, on which we base our decision that a country is a particularly difficult violator of human rights. So those are the main functions of the commission. Individually, each member of the commission, when they're elected, becomes country rapporteur for a certain number of countries. I had Chile, I had Ecuador, and I had the CARICOM countries, all the English-speaking Caribbean. And we also each had a thematic report. I had the theme of the rights of indigenous people. In the last couple of years, since I left the commission, they've decided to add several thematic topics. So some of the commissioners now have 2 or even 3 rapporteurships. One of the, Margaret May Macaulay, who was the unique commissioner who was once a judge on the Inter-American Court and is now on the commission. She is rapporteur for Afro-descendants and for the rights of women. So she has both of those mandates. All right, so I've got the commission established and functioning. So the next change occurred in 1967 when the OAS adopted the Protocol of Buenos Aires to amend the charter of the OAS. That amendment became extremely important because it added a provision on the adoption of the Convention on Human Rights, but it also said until that convention came into force, the existing commission, which was then named a principal organ of the OAS, would have jurisdiction over human rights. So what that did is it transformed the commission into a principal organ, but it also made the declaration legally binding on the member states. So the protocol went into force in 1970. And from that point, and the convention was adopted in 1969, but it didn't go into force until 1978. So the court was established in 1979 and began hearing cases right away. Its first 3 cases against Honduras concerned disappearances in that country. It has now issued more than 200 judgments involving almost every state, but not all of them, because first of all, the state has to have accepted the convention, the treaty, and secondly, they have to opt into the court's jurisdiction. So 25 states have ratified the convention, but only 22 of them have accepted the court's jurisdiction. And the main holdouts on ratifying the convention are the Caribbean countries, partly, as I say, because they largely became independent after the commission and the convention were already written. And in addition to that, many of the Caribbean countries retain the death penalty, and they don't want, the convention does not abolish the death penalty. So they have objected to that, and so they have avoided ratifying the convention. But they are very much subject to the jurisdiction of the commission, and the commission has issued country reports and also decided cases involving many of the Caribbean countries. And some of them have gone to court and have accepted the court's jurisdiction, including Suriname, which is a member of CARICOM. And there have been several important cases against Suriname. So I'll just close by mentioning that in addition to the convention, as I said at the outset, human rights is a work in progress. And so the OAS and the commission have not stopped drafting additional instruments. In addition to the convention, there are two protocols to it. One protocol on economic, social, and cultural rights, which are not a major part of the original convention, and a second protocol on the abolition of the death penalty. Furthermore, they've adopted, based on the UN standards, a convention to prevent and punish the acts of torture, as well as the first convention in the world on the prevention, punishment, and eradication of violence against women, the Convention of Belém de Pará. It was the first one in the world. Since then, the UN and the European system have both adopted similar conventions. There's also a treaty on forced disappearances, again, the first one in the world, and a convention on the elimination of discrimination against persons with disabilities. Furthermore, in addition to these binding treaties on the states that ratify them, there have been a number of important declarations and resolutions. Perhaps most important is the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which is one of the things the Commission uses and the Permanent Council uses in testing whether there has been an illegal coup, and in fact, all coups are declared illegal, against the democratic order in a state. That was adopted September 11th, 2001, a very memorable date for other reasons. There's also a declaration on principles on freedom of expression. And of course, the Commission and the court both have their statutes and their rules of procedure. So there's quite a lot that has evolved and come into force in the years since the next year will be our 60th anniversary of the Commission. So much has happened in those 60 years. So far, the Commission has managed to maintain its independence and its functioning despite criticism from several of the states that get concerned about progressive measures taken by the Commission. The last thing I'd mention, which I forgot, is that another important function of the Commission and the court is to issue precautionary measures or interim measures anytime an individual or a group's human rights are threatened with irreparable harm. And that has become a very important function. It's also created a lot of backlash. So I'll stop there and take questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shelton. That was incredibly informative and a very helpful overview of the different functionings of the Commission and its history as well. So you mentioned your designation within the Commission as being sort of the specialist for indigenous rights. And I was hoping that you could speak to that further. Obviously, Latin America is home to an enormous and diverse group of indigenous populations, nearly 50 million people, and about 500 different ethnic groups, according to the United Nations Development Program. And of course, population distribution between rural and urban areas varies based on country, but generally speaking, indigenous communities are and will continue to be disproportionately affected by climate change in particular and other forms of environmental degradation. So my question is, what role has the Inter-American Commission and Court played to protect these communities and their right to a clean environment, and what work is yet to be done in your view?
Thank you for that question, Lucy. The Commission and the Court have been very active in regard to indigenous people, particularly in regard to the detrimental role of extractive industries in the hemisphere. There have been many mining projects, including the Marlin mine in Guatemala, dam projects, including dams in Panama and elsewhere, that have seriously devastated the environment. And the court has made it a point of saying that the right to property is not just an individual right, but for indigenous people, it is central to their identity. And so in several cases, including cases that the Commission has decided and ones that the courts have decided, the court and the Commission have said that every country must demarcate boundaries and give title to the traditional lands of indigenous people in order for them to maintain their culture. So they have collective property rights throughout the hemisphere. And that has been very important. And together with that, there are also procedural rights that any project, public or private, that threatens to have an impact on the environment of indigenous peoples or on their property rights, they must be given advance notice, they must be allowed to publicly participate, and they must be afforded access to justice and a remedy in case of any harm. So I mentioned the precautionary measures and the pushback that we got. One of the main precautionary measures that the Commission issued in 2009 was against Brazil. And it had to do with a dam on the Amazon River that would have flooded the indigenous lands of approximately 12,000 indigenous people. So the Commission told the government, do not go forward with this project until you have fully consulted with everyone that is potentially affected by this dam. It was called the Belo Monte project. Well, as it turned out, the project was the baby of the then president of Brazil, who had formulated it when she was the Minister of the Environment. So she went bonkers when that precautionary measure was issued. She withdrew the ambassador and cut off $50,000 of funding to the Commission and called for the Permanent Council to review the precautionary measures mandate of the Commission and tried to, in every way possible, to limit our authority to issue such measures. But we continued and we rewrote the measures to give states more notice of what we were going to do and allow them to comment before the measures were issued. But we've continued to issue the measures and take indigenous people's cases to the court. And the court has been consistent in saying procedural rights of information, participation, and remedy, and substantive rights to have their lands demarcated and titled to them. I mentioned also my on-site visit to Canada. We learned via reports from the Canadian Indigenous people that more than 500 Indigenous women had disappeared or been murdered in British Columbia over the last decade. So we went to the commission. I went as the rapporteur for Indigenous people. I went along with one of the Jamaican member of the commission who was the rapporteur on the rights of women. And we visited Parliament, and then we went to British Columbia. We met with members of the provincial government. We met with Mounties. And then we went on site and talked to many of the Indigenous people. And we uncovered a really tragic situation there and issued a really scathing report, which the Canadian Parliament has taken up for action. So it's had a big impact. I was never able to make an on-site visit to the United States because, of course, I couldn't.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I also wanted to ask, just because you mentioned it briefly earlier, that although clearly the Organization for American States and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and its related bodies do very important work, there are nevertheless critics of these organizations, the OAS, particularly the role that the United States plays in the OAS, with critics sometimes claiming that the United States wields disproportionate influence over the body. Obviously, the organization is housed in Washington, D.C., rather than somewhere in South America or in Central America or the Caribbean. And the body also received some criticism last year from primarily more left-leaning individuals over the handling of the Bolivian election. So I wanted to ask, how would you describe the geopolitical balance within the commission during your tenure? And what do you see as the future relationship between the United States and the OAS under the incoming Biden administration?
Thank you. Well, that's another very important question. The main criticism of the US is that it has not ratified any one of the human rights treaties, none. And for the first time in history, the Trump administration did not nominate anyone to the commission in the last election. Every 2 years before that, when the term of the commission changes, the US has nominated somebody. But the Trump administration decided not to nominate anyone which will probably help in alleviating some of the notion that the US dominates it. But I mentioned, and I will emphasize again, that I never received any instructions from anyone in the State Department or the White House or Congress with regard to any of my functions on the commission. So, but there is an issue about universality. And I went down several times to the State Department to try to urge it to ratify any of the treaties. I said, pick any of them. Pick the Convention Against Torture, because it's modeled after the UN Convention Against Torture. We won't have to make any changes in domestic law. We've already adopted all the legislation necessary. But I didn't get very far with that because the legal advisor thought there would be some problems. So anyway, that's kind of how the US role has been. It made a huge difference when I was nominated as a woman to go on the commission, because it took care of one of the criticisms that the US had faced, that it was always nominating a series of the same looking persons to come on the commission. So as far as the commission is concerned, I was telling you before we started that for 9 years now, George Washington University has continued a program I began when I was on the commission, because of the fact that the Caribbean countries came into the system very late. And as a result of that, they found themselves in an organization that was largely Spanish speaking, and Hemisphere organization was toward the south. My biggest problem on the commission was that most of the cases, the decisions we rendered were first drafted in Spanish, and then they were farmed out to ad hoc translators. And some of the translations were so bad, I couldn't understand what they were trying to say, because Spanish, the dialects differ up and down the Latin America. And so a person who is fluent in Mexican Spanish may not use the same terminology as someone in Argentina. So, you know, we had a lot of problems with that. So I started this training program for Caribbean lawyers and diplomats. And we had about 40 people this year. The training seminar this time was on Tuesday. And it has encouraged them to reconsider ratification of the American Convention or other treaties. So it's had a big impact on their willingness to both nominate commissioners, nominate judges, and interact with the commission and the court. So I think it's going to have a big impact long-term in redressing the ballast. One of the things I always emphasize to the Caribbean countries is that if you subtract the US, if you subtract Haiti, which is French speaking, and Suriname, which is Dutch speaking, and Brazil, which is Portuguese speaking, and divide up the rest of the countries, there are almost equal number of Spanish speaking and English speaking member states in the OAS. So the Caribbean countries have nothing to be concerned about of being dominated by a Latin American organization.
Thank you. And I just would like to remind everyone that you can submit questions. We have one that was pre-submitted, but as the event continues, if you have a question for Professor Shelton, you can either put it in the chat or raise your hand and I will call on you. So the one, we did receive one question that was submitted ahead of the event. And the question from this individual is, what are the consequences, if any, of the recent Abreu affair regarding the non-renewal of the IACHR Executive Secretary's mandate? So this was the non-renewal of Paulo Abreu's tenure as the Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which was done by Secretary General Luisa Malgro. So I guess what are the consequences of this and what does this indicate about leadership dynamics within the OAS? Or Professor Shelton, I think you might be muted.
There has been a lot of discussion of that within the commission and outside the commission. There was a fair amount of criticism of the executive secretary, as there have been of his predecessors, but this is the first time that the Secretary General has exercised his authority to not renew the mandate. He has that authority under the OAS Charter. The commission recommends to the Secretary General an executive secretary, but the statute and the charter are very clear that the executive secretary is appointed by the Secretary General. So I think that, you know, there were certainly politics involved in that and criticism of the Secretary General for his actions. But there was also a feeling that the executive secretary had not been very effective, and it was not a bad thing that he actually went.
Thank you. We have another question submitted from the audience. This one is, how can the United States leverage its role in the OAS as well as in multilateral institutions to protect the lives and cultures of indigenous people in the Americas?
Well, I think the primary thing would be to do better at home with our own indigenous people. The COVID-19 virus has hit indigenous communities much more than any other community in the United States, and it's been completely ignored. There's also been a tremendous amount of violence against women and children in the indigenous community. There was one good development with the Supreme Court decision telling Oklahoma that it had to return all the lands to the communities there and to not exercise jurisdiction over criminal violations in the area. But I do think it would be very important in the future for the US to take a more proactive role toward our own indigenous people and set an example for other countries. In addition to that, I mentioned that the biggest problem in Latin America and Central America in particular has been with extractive industries, mining companies. Canada has the worst record in that regard, far worse than the US. But US companies have also not played a very good role. Unfortunately, the Commission has no jurisdiction over private entities. We cannot hear cases brought against any company, Chevron or any other. We can only hear cases brought against states. So in the Marlin Mine case, we had to take the case against Guatemala. Now, we could issue precautionary measures and did, asking Guatemala to suspend the operation of that mine because of its impact on indigenous people. So I think, and I'll just parenthetically say that there was a hearing in Congress in which I participated, in which the Subcommittee on Human Rights was actually talking about the role of US companies in Latin America with regard to indigenous environment and so on. So I think that the US could actually play a much stronger role in trying to control the behavior of corporations abroad.
Great. We have another question from the audience. I think this will be maybe the last one or one of the last ones. What is the role of the OAS in Venezuela? How did it handle the leadership uncertainty between Juan Guaido and Nicolas Maduro?
Well, I can't speak a lot about the role of the executive or the Secretary General because the Commission acts independently of him as much as possible, nor of the legal office. But I will say that the Commission, since 2001, has kept a very close eye on Venezuela and has included it every year in Chapter 4 as one of the worst violators of human rights. It's asked to make an on-site visit. It has been refused permission to go there. It has taken cases to the court before Venezuela denounced the convention. We can't force Venezuela to stay in the convention, but we can maintain our jurisdiction over the country and over the government and what it's doing. In terms of the government, the Commission doesn't really take a political stance on who is recognized. That's for the political organs.
Thank you. And so this will be, I think, our last question. It's a bit more broad, but it's also forward-looking. In your opinion, what should be the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights' top priority in the post-pandemic moment? Obviously, the region was facing multiple human rights crises prior to the pandemic, many of which have been aggravated in the past, several months. More broadly, what role do you see the OAS playing as countries navigate pandemic recovery?
Well, the PAHO, Pan American Health Organization, has been wonderful in the work it has done, and I fully support everything they are doing. But in addition to the constant evolution of the human rights system, there's also a constant evolution in the domestic political systems of countries in the region. And we've seen pendulum swings. We've seen periods of right-wing dictatorships. We've had left-wing dictatorships. It's gone back and forth. And I think there's one of the good things that the OAS did with the Protocol of Washington was to adopt an amendment to the charter that said that in the case of a coup, this was following up on the Inter-American Democratic Charter, any government that came to power via extra-constitutional means would be suspended from participation in the organization. That was used against Honduras in 2009, and it remained excluded from the OAS until a restoration of what was perceived as a democratic government. So I think it's important to keep an eye on the political situation in the regime in the hemisphere. Peru has recently undergone quite a series of problems with who is going to be its president. It's gone back and forth, and Congress has intervened in this almost the same way that Congress intervened in the case of Honduras in 2009. So there's always a risk that populism will go to authoritarianism and lead to an autocracy that is very dangerous, and it tends to spread. The commission has a very important role to play, and so do the political organs. One of, I think, the most important landmark decisions that was reached in the OAS Permanent Council was when the commission went to Nicaragua and did a report on the human rights situation there, and found that, in its words, there was a dire human rights situation in Nicaragua, which the solution to which was within the domestic political sovereignty, but it could only be taken care of by the immediate and definitive overthrow of the Somoza government, which happened within 6 months. So that was an issue where the political bodies did their job following up on the commission's investigation of human rights violations in Nicaragua. So I think that it's very important for the future that the political organs support the commission and the court in their work and take action where action is needed.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So in our last few moments, we're going to open it up for a moment to debrief the discussion that we've just heard from Professor Shelton. And this is a moment for anyone in the audience to ask further questions or just give general reflections on today's discussion. And then we'll move into some closing remarks. Let's see.
Let me first thank everybody for the questions and for your participation and being here. It was great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's been a very insightful conversation. It's been really wonderful hearing about your experiences and you know, deep knowledge of humanitarian issues within the hemisphere. So if anyone would like to give a reflection, you can just raise your hand and I'll call on you, or you can put something in the chat too. So Awad, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear. So thank you so much, Professor Shelton, for this talk. It was really illuminated a lot of things about the region and about human rights in general. And I think that my biggest takeaway, which actually kind of goes off of something that I mentioned to you just briefly before the call, is that, you know, it's very easy to look at human rights as this kind of general concept, like this big kind of nebulous idea, but it was really helpful to talk out the system that's in place and look at examples that you had experienced in your own career to kind of understand the in-between, you know, how we get from this big idea to actually making progress on the ground towards addressing issues of human rights up and down the hemisphere. And so I really did appreciate that, and that's something that I think is important to keep in mind, not only for this particular case, but in looking at international orgs across the board and in other regions. And it was really helpful to hear from someone who had experienced that. So thank you so much. Oh, I see that Elizabeth has her hand raised.
Thank you. I also just wanted to say thank you to Professor Shelton and also to Alad and Lucy for doing such a great job with this event. I've been following sort of the political crisis that has been happening in Peru. And this event has particularly, for me, been thought-provoking in considering the OAS's role in anti-corruption efforts, in addition to promoting democratic institutions that function and function well. It also has sort of made me consider like the US's credibility on that stance in terms of Trump's rhetoric surrounding the transition of power. So those are all things that I've been thinking about throughout this discussion, and I really enjoyed all of your comments, Professor Shelton, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth.
So with that, we have a few minutes. Professor Shelton, if you'd like to give some closing remarks on the event, and then we'll conclude. And I believe we're on the hook to take a group photo too before the end of the event.
Thank you, Lucy. Well, I pretty much ignored the importance of the court. So let me just add a few remarks about what the court is able to do that the commission cannot. The commission will issue a decision that human rights have been violated or not been violated. What the court adds is remedies. They actually award compensation, they issue injunctions, they issue orders to a state on what it has to do, and they're very important. Chile changed its constitution to comply with a decision of the court, which nobody thought would happen before the case was brought. So the remedial power of the court is extraordinary, and they have used that power in the more than 200 cases they have decided. So I didn't want to overlook the court by focusing entirely on the commission. But I appreciate all the questions, which made me think about some issues. And I hope that in the Biden administration, we will see more engagement. I've already been in talks with some people there who are proposing that the next General Assembly of the OAS will be held in Washington, which it hasn't been in quite a while. And the thought is that this would be a good time to propose a charter of environmental rights. And I'm 100% behind that.
Thank you so much, Professor Shelton. And before we do conclude, I just want to go ahead and thank again, Professor Shelton. I want to thank Lucy and Elizabeth also for helping us in the planning. It's really been a wonderful event, and I want to acknowledge that, of course, the O'Neill Institute and the BPE fraternity and sorority at UW for helping make this possible. And finally, just everyone who joined. It's so wonderful to have so many people who are just really engaged. While we're all stuck at home still, he's being able to stay in tune with what's going on in the world and all these different important issues. So I wanted to just quickly, I'm going to send to the chat the information of the orgs who are involved in the making of this. And as Lucy alluded to, what we like to do in this series is take a group photo at the end. So for those of you who are still around, thank you for staying all the way to the very end. And we love it if you could share your camera, and if not, that's totally fine. But those of you who are comfortable, I'll give a few seconds to decide, and then I will take the photo. All right, I'll go for it. Ready? I'll give it a count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Got it. Well, thank you so much. Again, thank you all for joining. We really have had a fun time putting this together, and we wish you a wonderful rest of your weekend and a wonderful remainder of your semester, and we hope everyone's staying safe and staying healthy. Take care, everybody.